Welcome, everybody. I would like to start with a personal note that I've known about this project for a couple of years, and I'm really happy that we can present it to you today. Pam Yost is our presenter and a key person in this project. She has been a watershed economist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for 21 years. She's worked in West Virginia and has provided watershed assistance to other states in the Appalachian region. Pam has a Bachelor of Science degree in Resource Management and a Master's degree in Agricultural Economics from West Virginia University. And this presentation today has 3 breaks for questions, 2 in the middle and 1 at the end. So as you're listening to it, line up your questions and you'll have 3 opportunities to ask them. So Pam, you may begin when you're ready, and others, it may take a moment for Pam to set up, and that's okay.
Okay, thank you all for joining us. My name is Pam Yost, and I'm the Economist in West Virginia. And I want to talk a little bit about our Dunder Creek Watershed project in West Virginia. It's something we've been working at for quite some time, and I thought we would share it with the country and see if there's interest in it. This is where we're located. For those of you who might not be from our state, we're in the central Appalachian Mountains. And within our state, this is where the watershed is located, more in the southern part of the state, mostly in Fayette County. All of the work is actually being done in Fayette County, West Virginia. A little bit of the watershed is in Raleigh County as well. This is some of the topography, what the topography looks like in Fayette County. This is actually the New River Gorge National Recreation Area. The watershed is within that larger drainage. And you can see the mountains here are very, very steep, very narrow floodplain with a little bit of flat land between the railroad tracks here on both sides. This is the New River, which is the larger body of water. The Dunder Creek drains into the New River, but you can see that there's very little flat land for building between the water and the hillside. And this is the typical topography for the area. This is what Dunder Creek looks like on a normal day. It's a small stream, not very deep, not very wide. You can see just off to the left here, the structures sit right along Dunder Creek, the banks of Dunder Creek. This is what Dunder Creek looks like on a typical flood day. It turns into a lake and inundates a lot of the buildings that are in the floodplain along Dunder Creek. Another picture of Dunder Creek. The stream channel is actually over here along this bank. This is the road that we're sitting on. Again, you can see this is the extent of the floodplain here, and this is the railroad tracks and the mountains just behind the structure. So there's not much flat land in Dunder Creek to put your house on. A little bit about the watershed itself, just for comparison. It has a relatively low per capita income compared to the United States. It has a high poverty rate there. We're at about 22% poverty. There's a lower educational level within Dunder Creek. And most importantly for this project, the median house values in Fayette County are around $35,000 compared to the national average of about $120,000. Within the Dunder Creek watershed itself, which is the smaller unit of Fayette County, the median house value is somewhere around $22,000. So these are modest houses, relatively low value houses. There's a lot of flooding in Dunder Creek, and we have a long history of flood events that we have listed here. They go back, of course, even further than 1986. But for your information, you can see that many of these were federal disaster declarations, several of them in the 2004 and 2003 time frame, which was actually during the peak of our planning in the watershed. So flooding is very familiar to the residents of Dunder Creek. Again, this is a shot of there's a highway here, a road in Dunder Creek. These are some of the houses along the stream. The stream is actually over here to the left normally. This particular house right here, you can see the high water mark right below the window of this house. So they received quite a bit of first floor flooding in that particular house. Some more houses in Dunder Creek. Gives you some idea of the size and structure of the houses. You can see on this fence, the high water mark, the water's been considerably higher than when this picture was taken. And again, we have a lot of first floor flooding in Dunder Creek, so a lot of the homes have water in the living area of the house. Typically, there are not basements in the Dunder Creek area. Very few of the houses have basements under them, so mostly crawl spaces and mostly first floor flooding. After we did our field work in the watershed, we did a lot of measurements of the stream channel and a lot of elevation shots on the buildings so we could figure out what the extent of the actual problem was. And this is the statistical translation of the flooding in Dunder Creek. So this is similar to how storms are predicted, like hurricane storms. This is just the statistical expression of that. So what we have for the 1% storm, which is what typically is referred to as the 100-year storm, which can occur anytime, 1% a year, we have almost 300 buildings affected. And then you can see the lower storms, the 2%, 4%, and 10% storms, which occur more frequently, also have a substantial amount of buildings affected. Again, we just want to remind everybody that one of the reasons the flooding is so severe in Dunder Creek is the topography. It just really limits where buildings can be built and increases the runoff from these steep hillsides. So again, the flat land is limited, and typically all of the roads and utilities in the watersheds are in the floodplain, on the flat land. It's more cost prohibitive to put the infrastructure on top of the mountains. So obviously it's located near the roads, which are typically in the floodplain. And then, of course, buildings are located near the roads and utilities, so everything gets built basically in the floodplain. We have a lot of encroachment on the stream, and then when we have a high water event, we have a lot of effects. This is a picture of Dunder Creek. Typically, the channel is over here. The normal stream is over here beyond this tree line. You can see there's a posted sign on that tree right there. This is somebody's yard when it's not flooding. This is a house right here along it's in the floodplain. The stream bank is actually over here. But you can see how rapid the water is when we get a high water event in Dunder Creek. It's very swift water, very rapid flow, and it affects the houses that sit right along the bank. So when we were looking at this project, one of the questions we often get is, why don't people just move from the floodplain? Why don't they just pick up and move? So there are some reasons why that doesn't happen very easily. Historically, the housing in this particular watershed, and a lot of watersheds in West Virginia, is located near where the industry was. And in this case, mining was the industry in this watershed. So a lot of the houses that we see there were built when the mines were put into place, and that is where the housing remains, so that is where the people remain. Again, we can think back about the value of those homes. A lot of those homes are lower value than what is sold elsewhere outside the floodplain. So those homes that are in the $22,000 to $35,000 range are the most affordable homes for people who live in this watershed who don't have high per capita income. And it's also very difficult to sell your home. It doesn't appreciate in value if it floods repeatedly. So it's very difficult to sell your home and move out of the floodplain and receive enough money to do so. This is, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is the New River Gorge National Recreation Area. So it's an area that attracts a lot of tourists. It has a lot of folks who come into the area for recreation experiences. There is some high-end housing outside of the floodplain, but it's very expensive. It's up on the mountaintops, and it's very limited. So if you think about the economics of the folks who live in Dunder Creek, that housing is generally not within their reach. And also, residents like to stay in their communities, near their neighbors, where they grew up. So there's some cultural reasons for staying in the locations where they are. Are there any questions at this point about the community or the flooding history there?
There are no questions at this time, Pam. You may proceed.
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about our history with the Dunder Creek Watershed, and it goes back a long ways. We've been talking to folks there since 1965, obviously on and off, but they've had a long-term flooding problem, and we've worked with them over the years to look for solutions. We actually had a watershed plan back in the 1970s that was never acted on, so planning stalled at that point. The sponsors, which are local units of government like the Fayette County Commission, the Southern Conservation District, the West Virginia Conservation Committee, and the City of Mount Hope are our local non-federal sponsors. They came back to us in 2001 and asked us again to look at the flooding issue and see if we could come up with a solution. That's a pretty long process, coming up with an environmental impact statement. It took about 5 years of field work, gathering data, house-by-house data, stream data, geology, and all kinds of information, engineering information that we needed to put together possible solutions to the flooding issue there. So it took about 5 years. We obviously had a lot of public meetings at that time. We had a lot of conversations with our sponsors and a lot of interaction with the local watershed group, which is a group of volunteers in the area who keep track of what we're doing and help us move this project along. In 2007, we finally released the environmental impact statement, which recommended a voluntary buyout. And we're going to go through some of the other things that were thought about in the environmental impact statement, but were not actually recommended. We'll do that in a second. But to give you the rest of the timeline, in 2009, the project went to Congress for authorization, which is also a pretty lengthy process just in itself. And all along the way, we've had a very dedicated group of people working on this project, including those local sponsors I just mentioned, as well as our field office staff in Beckley and our management staff here in Morgantown. So again, just some pictures of typical housing in the watershed and a flooding event that occurs there. Again, you can see in the background, this is a road. You can see the hillsides here. So it's a very small floodplain, very limited flat land for building. Part of the environmental impact statement process was to look at all the different alternatives that could be done to solve the problem in Dunder Creek. We didn't come up with a floodplain buyout first thing off the bat. In fact, we went to what we call these structural alternatives, which are typically the things that NRCS does in watersheds to solve flooding issues. And we're going to call these hard engineering solutions for this conversation. We looked at 2 flood control dams in the watershed. We're going to talk about each of these individually in a minute, but I'll go through them now. And we also looked at what's called channelization, or changing the configuration of the channel itself. We looked at installing flood walls and dikes in the watershed. And we also looked at clearing and snagging, which is removing the vegetation from the stream bed and the stream banks. We looked at some things called non-structural alternatives, or what could be referred to as soft engineering practices. We looked at the possibility of elevating homes or floodproofing homes. We looked at installing warning systems, and we also finally looked at a floodplain buyout. These were all the things we looked at in great detail. We had a cost analysis on each of these, and we had environmental impacts on each of these alternatives, and that's all included in our environmental impact statement. Some of the reasons why the hard engineering alternatives didn't work for Dunder Creek, we looked at 2 dam locations in the watershed. There were only 2 physical locations that we could identify. One was too far upstream from the damage area to really do much good. There was too much drainage coming in below the site. And then the other site was unfortunately too far downstream. It was below the major damage area. So it was not conducive, neither site was conducive to put in a flood control dam. We also mentioned earlier that this watershed has been mined, coal mined, deep mined, underground mined. So installing flood control dams in that kind of situation is very expensive. The foundation of the dams has to be grouted to ensure that it's stable, and that adds cost to flood control dams. So that was a factor in considering whether flood control dams were worthwhile for Dunder Creek. The next thing we looked at was the channelization, or straightening or realigning the stream. Again, we have a very narrow floodplain there, so topography just didn't give us enough room in the floodplain to move the stream around and keep the houses in place. We would have had to take out most of the buildings just to get the channel realigned, which basically defeats the purpose of trying to channelize. We had the same issue with flood walls and dikes. We just don't have enough room there between the stream bank and the houses that sit next to the stream to install flood walls and dikes. And then finally, we looked at the clearing and snagging alternative, which is not very effective. It basically doesn't address the higher flood events. And again, we have topography and the velocity of the water there to consider, and it just wasn't an effective alternative for Dunder Creek. So we looked a little closer at the soft engineering alternative to see if that was a possibility. We looked at elevating homes, which is something that's done in some watersheds, putting them up on piers, elevating the first floor above the floodplain. Unfortunately, the structural integrity of these houses just couldn't withstand elevating. They're not built structurally sound enough to withstand that kind of modification. And we also have the high velocity water to deal with there, so that created a safety hazard. In almost all instances, the cost obviously exceeded the value of the house to elevate it, so this just really wasn't a viable option for Dunder Creek. We also looked at floodproofing, and that's something that doesn't work real well with older homes. Floodproofing measures are things like sealing off basement entries, putting in backflow drains, sealing window entries, and those things just weren't going to work real well with the type of housing that we have in Dunder Creek. We also looked at possibly installing warning systems that would give people enough time to evacuate the floodplain and possibly move their contents or their cars and so on. Unfortunately, they have very rapid flooding there. It's flashy flooding. There's not much time between when we have a rainfall event and we actually have flooding. So the early warning systems they weren't going to work there for that topography. So that left us with the only option that we could come up with, which was a floodplain buyout. We had not done one of these before, so this was something we weren't sure was going to be received by the community, and we weren't real sure about how to actually implement this type of alternative. But we did have some advantages to a floodplain buyout that we thought it was worthwhile to pursue it. It was the least cost measure, and it solves the problem for 100% for those who take it. If you take the buyout and you move from the floodplain, you do not have any residual flooding from, storms that exceed 100 years or nuisance flooding. You basically solve the problem 100% for those who take it. We have some issues in this watershed with a lot of high water rescue efforts that need to be done. We have an elderly population, and so evacuation of the floodplain is not a problem for those people who've actually decided to move from the floodplain. They're not left in the high water and don't need to be rescued by first responders when we have a flood event. And one of the criteria that our sponsors felt very strongly about was that this needed to be a voluntary buyout. We did not want to make this a mandatory buyout. We did not condemn any property in Dunder Creek. It's 100% voluntary. There are some folks in the watershed who choose to stay and do not want to take the buyout, and that's acceptable. So once the property, the houses are removed, the floodplain is restored to natural conditions, and there's an easement placed on the property. I'll explain a little bit later about the nature of the easements. But the floodplain itself is returned to just natural conditions along the stream. One of the other things we liked about the floodplain buyout was we did not have any environmental issues, any environmental concerns raised by EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the state environmental agencies. They found this solution to be very favorable. Again, another picture of the flooding. You can see on this house right here, high water mark right there, which is obviously above the first floor. And this is typical of the style of housing that we're talking about buying out in Dunder Creek. There's a little bit of a range, but that's a typical house. There were some concerns with the floodplain buyout. It's not a perfect solution, and we wanted to acknowledge those concerns. One of the concerns right off the bat was the loss of property tax revenue. There's one incorporated area in the floodplain. It's called the City of Mount Hope. They had some concerns about the impact to their city, and the county also had concerns about a government project coming in and offering people the opportunity to leave the floodplain and what kind of impact that would have on tax revenue. We had a lot of concern from the City of Mount Hope with the loss of customers from their public water system. So we recognized that that was going to happen, and we made some accommodations in our cost-benefit ratio to perhaps compensate for that. Actually, we have found that most people who have taken the buyout have stayed very local, just almost within the same community as possible. So we've actually not experienced much of a loss from the public service district customer base. We also had some concerns about a project hastening people moving out of an area that they're already leaving. So this is a town in West Virginia, a community in West Virginia that's experiencing an out-migration already, and a lot of communities are struggling with that, and this project was possibly going to increase that. We recognize the neighborhood itself is going to change. It has changed considerably since we started the buyout, and that's a social impact that we wanted to acknowledge. Again, it's a voluntary project, so we have a number of people who chose not to take the buyout, who have stayed in the floodplain, and who do experience flooding, and that's part of the choice that this project offers. So they have reasons for doing that, and we wanted to just acknowledge that it's a voluntary project. Because we have easements on all of the properties that are being purchased, there's a need to monitor those easements and make sure that they stay in natural floodplain conditions. That's a burden for the sponsors and for the NRCS. We have an annual monitoring that needs to be done on those properties to make sure that they're not being built on. And because there is flat land now exposed in the watershed, and it doesn't have structures on it, so there is some pressure there from time to time to put development back on that flat land. We've had some new activities occur in the watershed that we did not anticipate. One being the Boy Scouts of America have recently begun to build a very large East Coast adventure camp in the watershed, not in the floodplain, but in the watershed. So that's brought new associated development to this area, a need for campgrounds and those sorts of things. So we have to constantly be vigilant about keeping the flat land that has floodplain easements on it in an undeveloped state. And we've had a lot of agency hurdles with this project. It's certainly a new activity for us in terms of how to implement this type of project, how to track it, how to fit it into our accounting systems has been a huge challenge for us. And it's been a very interesting project, but we've had a lot of our own agency hurdles to overcome. Again, another picture of a house in Dunder Creek. This one happens to be a two-story house. There is a small area there where there are a number of larger homes. This is a typical one. Again, this was coal camp housing, so these houses were built to accommodate miners in the region. This one has a basement. You can see the basement window right here. You can see the debris line on the fence in front of this house. So they've had substantial water on the first floor. You can see the water line over here on the garage next to the house. And these are high water events that these people have experienced a number of times. Are there any questions at this point about the alternatives we looked at or why we decided to go forward with the buyout?
We do have two questions. One is from Siri Wickrell-Maratne, and the question is, what is the nature of employment in this community now? Is it still related to mining?
It is still a mining community for the most part. It's actually an elderly community. The average age is above the state average. So we do have a lot of elderly in the community. It's about 20 minutes from a larger city in West Virginia called Beckley, and that's a regional shopping area, so a lot of the folks drive to Beckley and work there. There is some seasonal recreation jobs in the community, not a lot, but it's a more of a bedroom community to the Beckley area where more jobs are located in that area.
Great, thank you. Lynn Knight wants to know, in what way did the neighborhood change after the buyout?
Well, of course, we have a lot less houses in some of those neighborhoods. So, when you drive through Dunlap Creek now and you look at the number of homes that have been taken out with the buyout, which is right at 100, we're right at 100 houses right now. That's a lot of houses to remove from a small community. Like I said, there were about 300 houses affected. So, just the physical visual of the community has changed a lot. Some of the folks who have decided to stay in the floodplain have, remarked about their loss of neighbors and their change in the view shed. Obviously, they have much more vacant land around them now.
Great, thank you. And Mike Monin, who is the easement with? The sponsor or the homeowner?
No, the easement is actually held by NRCS, USDA. The county has taken title to the land that's within the county boundaries. The Fayette County Commission holds title to that land. Within the city of Mount Hope itself, which is about 1/3 of the properties, that municipality holds title to those lands, and then NRCS holds the easement on all of those titles.
I think the next two questions are going to be better asked after your last part of the presentation, Pam. So let's continue with the presentation.
Okay. So when we look sort of back at this, we're not done with this project, but we look back at it from this point, we kind of see two sides, and we have the social side of the project, which has probably been the bigger part of the effort, really. A lot of that has been building relationships, which of course started way back when we were developing the environmental impact statement and we were doing the field work, working with our sponsors, working with the Watershed group there. So that has been an ongoing process all along the way, and it's been challenging. We've had relationships there that we had to repair from time to time. We've had disappointments we've had to overcome. Certainly the community was very disappointed when we didn't come up with a couple watershed dam locations that would solve the problem. So we had to work very hard on keeping good relationships with the community, and that's been very important all the way along. One of the things I think has been a benefit for the project has been we've kept a lot of the same people on the project for the whole time frame. I'm not so sure we did that consciously, but it has happened. So the people in the community know who we are, and we know them quite well. They've seen the same people for several years now, and I think that's given us some continuity. We've spent a lot of time talking about the project. We continue to do that to this day. We've had many, many public meetings down there, a lot of one-on-one communication. We actually did a door-to-door campaign the first year. We had 2 summer employees who went to every house in the watershed that was affected by flooding and knocked on the door and talked to the homeowners there, explained the program to them. We knew there would be a lot of people that wouldn't come to a public meeting or wouldn't speak at a public meeting, so we wanted to try to reach them as many ways as possible, and the door-to-door campaign was actually very successful. We, of course, do lots of phone calls. We have a newsletter. We've had a lot of media coverage. It's a fairly rural area, but they do get media coverage from the city of Beckley has some television stations there and a newspaper, so they're covered by that media outlet. One of the things we continue to work on constantly is rumor control. Anytime you have a government project coming into a rural area that has a pretty substantial impact on the neighborhoods, there's a ton of rumors, and we try very hard to keep on top of those. We continue to emphasize that this project is a voluntary project, and that's, even though we say that from the beginning, we have to continue to emphasize that. There's, again, related to rumors, there's a lot of concern that at some point it's going to become an involuntary project, and of course that's not the case, but we continue to talk about the fact that it's a voluntary project. One of the other things we did was pull in some expertise that we don't have and we knew was probably needed, but we didn't think it was within NRCS's purview to provide. But we have offered some events in the watershed to try to connect people there who are taking this floodplain buyout to some other expertise that they might need. We did a housing fair and we invited bankers and home builders in to talk to landowners. We've also enlisted the aid many times of the county commissioners in the watershed who are our local sponsor. They have a lot of connections to social services and legal aid and some other things that some of the residents need those services. We can't provide them from this agency, but we've tried to fill those gaps in with other people who could provide them. And then we have the sort of the technical side of the project, which is the other side of the social side. One of the things we struggled a lot with right off the bat was how to prioritize the properties in the watershed for the buyout. And we wanted to be sure when we did that we had some pretty sound science behind our method for ranking properties. I should say that almost 100% of the properties in the watershed are houses, residential houses. We have only a handful of businesses, so we are dealing almost exclusively with residential property. One of the things we did was we used our engineering and economics work, field work, to determine which properties had the most severe flooding problems, how many feet on the first floor, at what events, and those were the type of criteria we used to rank properties. We thought that was the most defensible mechanism, and it was less subjective than, some of the other suggestions were to use possibly some social indicators for homeowners. We felt like that probably wasn't the best idea. So we wanted to keep a hold of the science and use pretty hard science to rank properties. We knew that NRCS, our agency, was going to be accountable for the project implementation and the fund management, and so we maintain those accounts. Our local sponsor, the Fayette County Commission, has administered all the local contracts for this project, but we are ultimately accountable for the money. So we work very closely with them to process invoices and to hire reputable contractors and to account for the funding on this project. That's one of the things that we have a local watershed group that we talk to. We used to talk monthly. We now talk every other month on a teleconference, and they get a complete accounting every 2 months of where we are on the project, how many properties we've got surveys on, how many we've got appraisals on, where we are in closings, where we are in the demolition process, and they know down to the penny what's in our accounts. So we have tried to be very accountable to them. We've paid for, the federal agency has paid for virtually all of the costs of acquiring the physical property. We've paid for the title searches, the surveys and appraisals, all of the closing expenses, the demolition of the house itself or the building, and then the site restoration of the floodplain. So we knew, based on the demographics of the watershed, that these were costs that would not be, the residents there would not be able to bear these costs up front. So the project was designed so that we pay for all of those costs. We also offer what we've termed an incentive payment, which we struggled with what to actually call this. But basically, it's a payment to each person who takes the buyout to help cover the financial gap between what their house is worth, which we know from looking earlier at those demographics that these are relatively low-value houses. We wanted to provide enough of an incentive to try to help close the financial gap between what they would get for their house from the appraisal amount versus what they might need to spend to be able to move out of the floodplain. So each primary resident gets an incentive payment, as well as we have a few renters in the community and a few businesses that also get an incentive payment. I mentioned that we have some really great sponsors on this project, and they do a lot of the work. As I said, the Fayette County Commission administers all of the local contracts for the project. We work very closely with them to pay those services, but they actually administer the contract. The state of West Virginia has contributed 10% to the project, and NRCS has contributed 90% of the total cost of the project. The Fayette County Commission and the City of Mount Hope agreed to accept title to the property once the buyout was completed, and that's very important. If we didn't have somebody to take title to the property, we wouldn't have a project. And we also, of course, hold those easements, but the city and the county agreed to take title. They understand that's in perpetuity, so that's a very long-term commitment on their part. And then we have a local watershed group that does a great job of at least advising us when there's a rumor circulating that we need to take control of, or keeping us up to date, keeping us accountable in terms of the fund management, and they've been very good to work with. I wanted to show you an example of one of the properties. This was property number 5 on our priority list. It gets a lot of first floor flooding, between 6 and 8 feet in the first floor of this house. And this is what it looked like, of course, during a flood, or after the peak of the flood, probably. And then this is the same property after that house has been removed. So basically it's just restored to floodplain. A little bit about the economics of the project. If you can think back to that slide that we showed, the different storm intensities, the 1% storm and so on, there was a lot of damage associated with each storm event, and those storm events were happening very frequently, as we saw from the number of federal disasters in the area. So our studies, when we ran that through our economics models, showed we were getting almost $1 million to somewhere upwards of $14 million in storm damage on a very frequent basis. The buyout itself cost $13.9 million. It's a one-time investment. So when we compare the cost of the repeated storms to the one-time buyout investment, it's a very cost-effective project. And that buyout cost was based on an 80% acceptance rate. We've actually exceeded that acceptance rate. So in the environmental impact statement, and I'm going to give you a website for that in a minute, it describes each of those alternatives that we talked about earlier, the dam sites, the channelization, the floodproofing, and so on. It describes each of those alternatives and puts a cost and a benefit to each one. It explains that the benefits are experienced over and over again, but the costs are a one-time investment. So in order to make the comparison there, we equate those things on what's called an average annual basis. It allows you to look at what the benefits are compared to the costs on an equal footing. And just to clarify for you, the benefits are the flood damages we avoid by removing the property, and the costs are the costs that we actually spend to acquire the property, the cost of a survey, an appraisal, and so on, and then the actual buyout of the house. In this project, when we break these two numbers down into average annual equivalents, we get a total project cost of about $648,000 a year. These are spread over 100 years. And then the benefits themselves are over $1 million a year, which are those flood damages avoided. That gives us a benefit cost ratio of 1.5 to 1, which is a good benefit cost ratio. It means that for every dollar we're spending, we're getting back $1.50 in benefits. And again, we should point out that for those folks who take the buyout, it's 100% effective. So what happened when we actually rolled out this idea to the community? We got pretty much an overwhelming response, which is kind of not what we expected. We weren't really sure what kind of reception we were going to get. We've never done a floodplain buyout before, and they're typically not something the community welcomes with open arms. But we did get a huge acceptance and very large attendance at our first public meeting. We got 255 applications. We actually took some applications on vacant lots that folks owned in the floodplain that were really of no value to them because they couldn't build on them. So we had a high application rate for buildings, vacant lots, and associated property. Within a year of having our sign-up, which was a 90-day one-time sign-up period, we closed the sign-up period in September of 2009, and by August of 2010, we had purchased the first house. So we tried to move our process along very rapidly. To this point, we've only had 13 property owners withdraw from the program, and they've done that at the point where we've actually done a survey for them, property survey and an appraisal. We've made an offer, in most cases, not all 13, but in most cases. And they decided to stay in the floodplain for a variety of reasons. Either they didn't feel the offer was enough, or they had emotional attachment to their house that they just didn't want to leave. There were a number of their own personal reasons for staying. But we think that's a pretty good limit on the number of people that have withdrawn. We haven't had a lot of people not take the project. As I said, we're about halfway through the project. We are closing on house number 100. So we feel pretty good about the pace. The residents there are a little impatient, but we're moving as fast as we can. And I wanted to show you, this is a visit we had from the former chief of NRCS, Chief David White. He came to the Watershed. He brought some ARA funding to the Watershed. We actually received a significant amount of stimulus funding from the stimulus funds that were sent out in 2010. And Chief White came to the Watershed after the Congressional authorization process and participated in a sort of a kickoff there. And that's him on the left talking to the media. And then this is our state conservationist in West Virginia, Kevin Wicke, this is one of our first landowners who actually took the buyout, and they're discussing the project there. So we've had a lot of leadership support for this project, and we've needed that within the agency because we also have a lot of agency struggles with how to actually implement this project. So this is a picture from March of 2010, another flood event. Since this time, this property has actually been removed. We had very few mobile homes in the Watershed, about 10. This is an example, though, again, of the narrow floodplain, the hillside right behind the structure, and the water inundating the first floor. Here are some websites to give you more information if you're interested in any follow-up. We have the environmental impact statement is posted on our website, and here's my email address, and we also can certainly talk privately or have another webinar if there's interest. I think, Madeline, that brings us to the last opportunity for questions.
Great, thank you, Pam. Well, we have quite a collection of questions here. So the first one is from Siri, and how about finding new areas for those who leave, like new jobs? Does the government help with these?
No, we didn't help with that. I think we recognized there were a lot of things that needed to be done in this project, but we had a limit as to how much the federal agency should and could do. And one of the things we felt like if we provided the payments to the landowners to relocate, they had to do some things on their own. They didn't actually have to put out money in terms of, we bought the property, but they needed to find another place to live. We did not assist with that. They needed to determine how they were going to actually move. We didn't provide movers. We didn't provide real estate specialists to them. We made those folks available at the housing fair. If they needed to seek that assistance, they would need to go do that on their own. But we actually did not provide any kind of relocation assistance per se, and we did not provide any job relocation assistance. What we actually found was that most of these people, almost all of them at this point, have relocated somewhere else in Fayette County out of the floodplain, but they wanted to stay very close to the area. Some have gone to Beckley, which I mentioned is a city about 20 minutes away. Most of those folks have stayed very local, and that's, of course, pleasing to the County Commission and the City of Mount Hope. They've actually assisted they've done some work in finding properties that are available, that are out of the floodplain, that have water and sewer available to them. So they've done some work on that end, but we did not do that at NRCS.
Thank you. Flo Schwartz in New York. Are there penalties or remedies for noncompliance with the easement? Are there any additional new zoning restrictions for those who stay?
There There are notices of easement violations. If we see an easement violation occurring, yeah, there will be a notice sent to the sponsors, and they need to remedy that. We've had a couple of instances where we've seen maybe a car parked in a vacant lot. We shouldn't be seeing any of that. We don't want to see any fencing or swimming pools or anything like that. So we haven't had a lot of easement violations yet, but we do have that language, and we have an operation and maintenance agreement with our sponsors, and we have language in that O&M agreement to address any easement violations that might occur. We've actually had very good luck with the Watershed group, the voluntary group in the Watershed, sort of policing the land for us and letting us know if there's some activity going on that doesn't look like it should be, building or something like that going on that shouldn't be done. And then the second question about zoning, I am not aware of any new zoning that's going to happen there. I think probably I'd have to refer you to the county for that, but I'm not aware that that's happening.
Thank you. Melanie McDermott, how did the local government deal with the loss of property tax revenue, with the loss of services, and what happened to schools?
Well, one of the things we looked at early on was the population is already declining in the watershed. It has been declining for quite some time, even before this project came in. So we knew there was already a declining population. The school there has actually, the high school has already consolidated just recently, and so that was already underway before this project came in. The city of Mount Hope has been able to accommodate the loss of some of their customers from their water system because they picked up some new revenue from the Boy Scout activities in the area, as well as the county's picked up a good bit of revenue from that source. So that's kind of been a blessing that we didn't anticipate. And then the other thing that's happened is we've actually been pleasantly surprised that a lot of the folks were able to relocate and stay on the same water system, just in a different part of the county or a different part of the city that's not in the flood.
Great, thank you. Carol Peterson wanted to know how much is the average cost per house for relocation?
I believe it's right at $80,000 at this point. The average appraisal on our houses is somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000, and that number fluctuates a little bit depending on which community we're in. And then we have each primary resident, if their house is a primary residence, they're entitled to a $30,000 relocation incentive. So that's on top of the appraised value of the house. And then the average demolition cost is around $12,000 to do the demolition of the house and then the site restoration of the floodplain. There's really sort of minimal site restoration. We don't have to do a lot of that.
Well, great. Thank you. Sean Brewer and I think Patrick Parson are really asking the same question, and that is, what percent of the homeowners took the buyout? And did they hear correctly that 100 out of 300 homes took the buyout?
We have more than 80% took the buyout. So we had, the 100 figure is the number of homes we've bought so far. We've bought 100 homes so far. We still have approximately another 100 properties to go, and that what's remaining to be bought are some vacant lots associated with houses, because we decided that we needed to sort of modify our project to capture vacant lots as well. So we have upwards of 80%.
Great, thank you. Melissa Shuck wants to know, were the homes completely removed and area restored to a native environment? And I think one of your slides answered that. But Pam, maybe you'd like to say a bit more about that.
Yes, the homes were completely removed. We did not offer any option for the homeowner actually moving the house themselves. That had been talked about at one point. Could a homeowner take their house with them and get sort of a reduced payment? We really didn't offer that option. So the houses themselves are completely removed. If there's a basement, it's filled in. If there's a water well, that's filled in. If there's a septic tank, that's removed. Utilities are unhooked and capped. So the property is just basically a flat yard when we're done.
Great, thank you. Fran Rex, Is there any assessment of the fish and wildlife habitat benefit? And it has another few sections here, Pam. Maybe an assessment of water quality before and after the project. Go ahead, answer that. So is there any assessment of fish and wildlife habitat and water quality?
Yes, in the environmental impact statement, we did the initial assessment of fish and wildlife habitat there and water quality data collection. This project itself is not designed to improve water quality or particularly improve wildlife and fish habitat, although that's been a side benefit. Definitely the water quality has been a side benefit. We know that a number of those houses had either dysfunctional septic systems or lack of septic systems. So by removing the house, we inadvertently removed that source of sewage as well. So we've definitely improved the water quality there just by removing some of the homes in the floodplain. And that is in the environmental impact statement, so if that person's interested, they could look. Okay.
And another part of the question from Fran, was the stream in good environmental health to begin with?
I would have to say the lower portion of the stream, when you get closer to the new river itself, the larger body of water that's the major recreation stream, that section of the stream is in pretty good shape. It's actually stocked with trout. It's within the National Park Service boundaries. The stream up in the more developed sections where the housing is had mostly yards, mowed right up to the stream bank, a lot of encroachment on the stream, a lot of sediment in the stream, some trash and garbage, those kind of things, some straight pipes. So the stream is better now than it was when we started, but it's improved.
Great, thank you. A.J. Logan, are impacts to the floodplain hydrology analyzed once the homes are removed? For example, the restored areas may actually increase the duration of the flood?
We have not done a post-hydraulic analysis study on the floodplain. I don't know that we're planning to do that. So the answer to that would be no at this point. We do know that by removing a lot of those houses, we're removing the debris that accumulates when we have a high water event. So we feel that we're, improving the flooding by removing a number of the houses in the floodplain.
Okay. All right. Great, thank you. So Carol Peterson wants to know, what is the program that NRCS is using for this project as far as timekeeping goes?
Timekeeping, we have an agency timekeeping system that's used for all of our programs. And this particular project is authorized under what's called the Public Law 566 Watershed Project, and that's the authorization for the project. So in our timekeeping system, in the agency's timekeeping system, we have a code for watershed projects, so we would just charge for that. Does that answer the question?
I had a technology a blip here on my computer, so I'm now on Holly's computer. Pam, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So, Ray Doherty, considering the federal budget sequester, does NRCS have adequate funding for the buyout program?
Yes, we do actually have all of the funding in hand at this point to complete what we plan to do in the environmental impact statement.
Is NRCS funding state-specific?
It's more project-specific. Each state has a state budget.
Okay. Ray Doherty.
If I answered that correct, I'm not sure if I answered that correctly, but.
Well, and Ray Doherty, if you would like to contact us, if this isn't a good enough answer, complete enough for you, that'd be great. Sarah McKiernan, if this project was funded by Congressional authorization, can we expect that NRCS might be doing buyouts in the future?
Well, I don't know what the future holds in terms of NRCS doing buyouts. There's very few projects that get congressionally authorized. This was only one of two projects in quite a long time to get authorized. I can't tell you when the last one was before this one. That's a very daunting process. So there are other programs that have the option for floodplain buyouts within them, but I don't know from an agency perspective what level of interest there is in actually doing that on a widespread basis.
And Kate Ash wanted to know about the loss of tax revenue. So you've mentioned this before. Is there something more you'd like to say about that issue?
Well, I guess I do want to point out that these were relatively low-value properties to begin with. So the tax revenue coming from some of these properties was less than one might think. And the output from the emergency services that have to be provided every time there's a flood in that area is pretty substantial. It's a pretty high burden on the county. So there has been some loss in tax revenue, but there's also been a decrease in the number of times they've had to do high water rescues and the other kinds of services they've had to provide during every flood. So it hasn't been, it was a concern at the beginning of the project, but I'll have to say the county commission there is extremely supportive of this project. So I think that they have felt like that there's some give and take here, and they have lost a little tax revenue, but they've gained in some other areas.
Great, thank you. And Sarah has another question. Has there been any effort to quantify the increased flood storage from the removal of the homes and the reduced flood damage to existing structures as a result?
No, we have not done that.
Okay. So could you speak just a little bit about how the benefits were quantified?
Well, as we discussed, the benefit, the biggest one is the flood damage avoided by removing the houses. So that was the biggest benefit. We know when we remove a house that we're not going to have repeated first floor flood damages on that house. And we know what those damages are based on our modeling. We know every time there's a 10-year storm, if it gets 6 inches of flooding on the first floor, we know what the dollar value of that damage is. So we can calculate how many times we're avoiding that by taking the house out, how many times we don't have to reinvest those funds into that house. So that's the biggest category of benefits, is the flood damage avoided.
Great, thank you.
Okay, then there were a couple of other categories of benefits, and one was some acknowledgement that water quality in the watershed is going to improve, so we did capture a little bit of benefit there.
Great, thank you. Casey Schrader wants to know, are remaining community members eligible for federal flood insurance?
Yes, they would be. There isn't anything in our project that excludes a homeowner from participating in any other project. At least we have not designed our project that way.
Great, thank you. We're almost toward the end here. Sean Brewer, does NRCS easement allow the city-county to use the properties as park and public services?
Yes, there are some provisions in the easement. We have to have a conversation with the local sponsors every time they want to do something with a piece of property. But we have talked about some things that would be compatible with natural floodplain conditions, like ball fields without, no fences or restrooms or bleachers or that sort of thing, but just flat ground that can be used for maybe soccer fields or open area. There's some discussion about walking trails. That may be a possibility. A number of the homeowners in the watershed who have chosen to stay there actually want to mow the lots next to them where another house was removed. And as long as they just want to use it as additional yard, they don't build on it, that's an agreement they have either with the county or the city. They can mow those properties if they want to keep them looking like lawn, and that's actually happened quite a bit. There are some community gardens and some private gardens in the watershed that have sprouted up on our easement properties, and that's acceptable, compatible uses, as long as we don't see anything there like a permanent structure, like a fence, bleachers, bathrooms, those sorts of things we couldn't accommodate. Of course, no buildings, but we do want to allow them to use the property if possible.
Great, thank you. Flo Schwartz, did you have to remove any public utilities such as telephone poles?
No, we have only capped the utilities at the individual house site lots. We have not removed any poles or lines because there's still a number of properties within the floodplain, so those are all interconnected. But we did cap the utilities and remove any connections at the house sites because we didn't want that to impede flooding, and we also don't want any houses put back on there. So removal of those utilities at the house site was important.
Great, thank you. And our last question is from Brian Stevens Hotop. Was NRCS responsible for any of the flood damages, or was the burden carried by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program?
We don't compensate people per se. We don't have a program that compensates people like FEMA does for flood damages. We can calculate the flood damages and quantify them. We don't compensate individual homeowners when they experience those, though.
Okay, and the last part of Brian's question, was FEMA and or disaster declaration funds available to NRCS for the project?
Disaster declaration funds were not available. We did not use that source of funding. We used a couple of different kinds of funding. We used the state funding, which was part of our cost share. We used PL 556 watershed funding through NRCS, and then we got some funding through the stimulus money. And one of the complicating factors on this project is we have to track each pot of money separately because each type of money has its own individual rules and strings as to what pieces of the project it can be used for. That's been complicated, but I'm sure that's typical on a lot of projects. But we did not use any disaster funding, and we didn't use any FEMA funding at all.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the good questions, and Pam for the great answers. And I'm going to have to turn this over to Holly and give her computer back.
Okay. Thank you, Madeline, for handling the questions, and Pam for an excellent presentation. Very interesting and somewhat different than what we normally hear with our webinars, and very stimulating conversation. Nicely done. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll take it from there. If you got any questions, contact Pam or Madeline. Thank you very much.